Welcome to episode 6 of Staging Shakespeare. Thanks for listening. I'm calling this episode, Why is Isabella Silent? And the Isabella I want to talk about is the central character in Measure for Measure. At the end of the play, Duke Vincentio proposes marriage to her, but Isabella makes no reply to his proposal, even though throughout the play she has demonstrated that she's confident and forthright when it comes to speaking. So why doesn't she say yes or no? And how do we stage this complex and puzzling moment in the play? That's the subject of this podcast. Measure for Measure isn't one of Shakespeare's most well-known plays, so I'm just going to sketch in a few plot details that are important to us in considering the end of the play. Briefly, the play starts with the Duke of Vienna leaving the city in the hands of his deputy, Angelo. Angelo then inaugurates a strict anti-vice regime, under which a young man, Claudio, is imprisoned and condemned to death for having premarital sex with his fiancée, Giulietta. Claudio's sister, Isabella, who was about to become a nun, is persuaded by one of Claudio's friends, Lucio, to plead with Angelo for Claudio's life. She does so, but Angelo offers her a bargain which she cannot accept. He will save Claudio's life if Isabella sleeps with him. Meanwhile, we find out that the Duke has not, in fact, left Vienna and has disguised himself as a friar in order to spy on Angelo, whom he suspects of being less virtuous than he seems. The disguised Duke persuades Isabella to fool Angelo, using a bed trick whereby her place in Angelo's bed is taken by Mariana, Angelo's jilted fiancée. Eventually, all these shenanigans are revealed in a final scene in which the returned Duke reveals that he has spied on Angelo's crimes and he forces the corrupt deputy to marry his fiancée, as well as reuniting Isabella with her brother Claudio, whom Angelo had plotted to execute even after he had sex with Isabella, or rather Mariana. So, having brought about a kind of happy ending for all the major characters in the story, the Duke then turns to Isabella and offers her his hand in marriage. And she says nothing. Nothing at all. Not a word. Measure for Measure has always intrigued me, ever since I first taught it back in the last century. I've also directed it twice, as well as performing the role of Abhorsen the Executioner in a French language production staged outdoors in Brittany when we were living there. It isn't a play that you can easily pigeonhole. It has elements of broad comedy and deep seriousness, but the label tragicomedy doesn't really do it justice either. Nor do I particularly like the sobriquet problem play, which was attached to it in the 19th century by the critic F.S. Boas in an attempt to compare the play to the dramas of Ibsen, which were very much in the ascendant at the time Boas was writing. But whatever description you give the play, you cannot get away from the fact that it is full of problems of one kind or another, many of which make life quite hard for both actors and directors. A good many of these problems attach themselves in one way or another to the character of Duke Vincentio, both in terms of his character and his action. And before we can really understand Isabella's reaction to his marriage proposal, we need to explore the Duke himself in more detail. In fact, having both taught and directed the play, I would say that until you have got to grips with the Duke, it's difficult to make any progress with the play at all. The kind of Duke that you and your principal actor decide to create will colour the whole of the production, and so it's there that I think we should start our exploration of how to stage the end of the play. We all know the proverbial expression, the ends justify the means, though we won't necessarily agree with the sentiment. This is at the heart of our problem with the Duke. Any modern actor is likely to try to follow Stanislavski's maxim when creating a character. When you play a good man, try to find out where he is bad. And when you play a villain, try to find out where he is good. So it is with the Duke. Vincentio has many good qualities. He appears to be concerned that Vienna has become a licentious city under his watch. He wants to rectify that and restore the city's moral compass. He wishes to protect Claudio from death, and Isabella from having to accept Angelo's sexual bargain. He knows of Angelo's unjust rejection of Mariana, and he wants to resolve that problem by engineering a marriage between them. All of these motives are essentially benign, and any actor and director working on the play will want to foreground them in creating the character of the Duke. And yet, how can we comprehend or excuse a man who places the city of which he is the ruler in the hands of a man whom he knowingly mistrusts? How can we support the idea that he allows Isabella to believe that her brother has been executed when, in fact, he has saved him from this fate in order, as he claims in soliloquy, to make her heavenly comforts of despair when it is least expected? How, finally, can we justify the humiliation which Isabella undergoes in Act 5, when the Duke pretends to disbelieve her when she accuses Angelo in public? Admittedly, Isabella is claiming falsely that Angelo had sex with her, when in fact it was Mariana whom he slept with. But this false accusation on her behalf is at the request of the Duke, in the guise of Friar Lodowick. He puts Isabella through a pantomime of shame before revealing the truth of the bed trick and thus bringing Angelo's machinations to light. One is tempted to quote Walter Scott's poem Marmion when considering the behaviour of the Duke. Oh, what a tangled web we weave when first we practice to deceive. So yes, the Duke is a character with good and bad intermixed. But then aren't we all? Does this in itself explain Isabella's silence? Not entirely, I think. So we need to look at Isabella herself if we're to understand properly what's going on at that moment in the play. When we first encounter Isabella in Act 1, Scene 4, she is in discussion with a nun, Francisca, who is explaining the rules which apply to the votarists of St. Clare, the particular order which Isabella wishes to join. And Isabella's first words tell us that she's a bit of a stickler for privation. She's actually disappointed that the nuns don't have to obey a stricter regime. Does this make her a fanatic? A masochist? An extremist of some kind? I probably would hold back on using those words to describe her, but I do think that Shakespeare is intending to indicate to us very early on in the play that Isabella is someone to whom compromise is an anathema. Should we admire her for that or criticise her? Yet again, it's hard to come down on one side or the other, which is what makes this play so fascinating. At the end of the day, though, I think that any actor playing the part of Isabella is going to want to find something commendable in this seeming rigidity of hers. And although I personally find religious extremism a trait which it's very difficult to stomach, when directing the play, I've worked with the actors playing Isabella to put that characteristic into some kind of balance with the rest of what we see of Isabella throughout the play. Of course, the most difficult moment for any modern audience is likely to be in Act 3, Scene 1, the scene where Isabella rejects Claudio's plea that she should sleep with Angelo to save his life. It's quite hard to take lines like, "I'll pray 1,000 prayers for thy death, no word to save thee," and "Mercy to thee would prove itself a bawd, 'tis best thou diest quickly." These are, I would say, even more shocking than her assertion at the end of Act 2, Scene 4, when she's left alone on stage after Angelo has proposed his sexual bargain to her, and she announces that more than our brother is our chastity, a conclusion which spurs her to visit Claudio in prison, secure in the belief that he too will abhor the escape route that Angelo has suggested. Doesn't all of our sympathy lie with Claudio in that scene? Can we retain any respect for Isabella when she rejects him so outrageously? Actually, I do think we can. But doing so brings us face to face with one of the biggest difficulties posed by our desire to stage a play written at the start of the 17th century. As L.P. Hartley writes in the fabulous opening sentence of his novel The Go-Between, "The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there." Whenever I direct a Shakespeare play, or any play written in the past, I am pulled in two directions. Part of me wants to foreground the things in the drama which seem to me to speak to us today. Another part of me wants to be faithful to the aspects of the play that are of its own time. These are things I don't want to airbrush out just because they're a bit difficult to live with in the 21st century. Being true to both these impulses can be quite hard sometimes, but in truth, it's part of what can make a play from another period a compelling theatrical challenge. Isabella's reactions to both Angelo and Claudio are rooted deeply in a concept of eternity which I do not share. Her devotion to her religious principles leads her to see an act of fornication between her and Angelo, whatever its motivation, as damnable. In pleading with her to go through with this act, her brother is asking her to put her immortal soul in peril. No wonder, then, that she rejects him, though perhaps she does so with a degree of harshness which we find hard to stomach. I may not share Isabella's worldview, but I can nevertheless recognise its value. I can also see that compromise is not necessarily a virtue, and so Isabella's uncompromising stance should not just be dismissed as fanaticism or rigidity. Are there such things as right and wrong? Or do we live in a world where there are no absolute truths? Of course, this is, I believe, exactly what Shakespeare wants us to wrestle with as we watch the play. It would be easy for him to make Isabella a more comfortable character, but he doesn't want to do that. He is just as uncompromising as she is. And so that brings us to the end, when the Duke proposes marriage to Isabella. It is many years since I directed the play myself, and I know that I would now be quite unhappy with the productions I created then. In both productions, it was my aim to bring about some kind of reasonably happy ending, and so, although the Isabellas in these performances said nothing, they gave the impression that they were more likely to acquiesce than not. Actually, I'm not alone in wishing to end the play this way. The RSC's artistic director, Adrian Noble, apparently had the same desire, as was revealed by Juliet Stevenson in an interview about playing Isabella for him in the company's 1983 production opposite Daniel Massey as the Duke, a production which I saw on its transfer to the Barbican Theatre in London. But I no longer feel that such an ending is justified, and I would like instead to make reference to two other RSC productions, one of which I saw at Stratford, and the other I only know about through reviews and commentaries. The production which I did see in Stratford was directed by Nicholas Heitner in 1987, with Josette Simon as Isabella and Roger Allam as the Duke. Staged at a time when the world was just coming to terms with the implications of AIDS for sexual relations, it gave a new validity to the sense that Isabella had a perfect right to preserve her body and her chastity if that was her desire. When the Duke proposed to Isabella, Simon stared at Allam in total disbelief. She remained rooted to the spot as the cast left the stage, following the Duke's exhortation, "So bring us to our palace, where we'll show what's yet behind that's meet you all should know." In fact, Isabella's incomprehension and obvious lack of acquiescence seemed to force the Duke himself to recoil from her and to exit the stage before the others, almost shamefaced by what he had said and done. I think the power of those final moments began the process of taking me to what I believe is a better understanding of the play's conclusion. Perhaps the most startling response, however, is that of Stella Gonnet as Isabella in Stephen Pimlott's 1994 RSC production. I didn't actually see this, but sincerely wish I had, for in response to the proposal from Michael Feast's Duke, Gonnet moved slowly across the stage towards him, and then rewarded him with a slap in the face. You might think that that would put an end to it, but you'd be wrong. Having given vent to her anger and disgust, Gonnet then appeared to reconsider. Against all expectations, she then kissed the Duke, breaking off the kiss in the middle and raising her hand to her head as if trying to make sense of what it was she was doing and what it was that she actually wanted. Needless to say, the audience found both the slap and the kiss very amusing and laughed out loud. The lights then faded on an uncomfortable-looking Duke and a weeping Isabella, looking at each other without moving, in such a way as to leave the conclusion of their future relationship deliberately in the balance. The critic, Peter Holland, writing of the production in Shakespeare's survey, concluded that Pimlott's ending could not have been more disconcerting. The more I think about it, the more I am utterly convinced that Isabella's silence at the end of Measure for Measure is not an authorial oversight or a mistake. Shakespeare didn't just forget that Isabella was expected to respond to the marriage proposal. He made absolutely sure that her response was silence, but a silence which speaks volumes. Exactly what you want that silence to say, as a director or an actor, will depend upon the journey which Isabella has taken through your production, and the possibilities are almost endless. Which is why the play will remain, I believe, consistently fascinating and robustly challenging. Like it or not, by the time he came to write the end of Measure for Measure, Shakespeare knew exactly what he was doing. Well, that's it. That's the end of episode 6. If you find that my conclusion doesn't chime in with yours, do remember that you can email me at podcaststagingshakespeare@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks very much for listening, and bye now.